This is the Voodoo Bizango Carbon. And as the name suggests, it's a carbon fibre 29er that retails for £1,000. The main features of this bike include a RockShox Judy silver fork with 120mm of travel, a SRAM 1x12 drivetrain supporting SX Eagle components, with a 32-tooth chainring on the front and an 11x50 cassette on the rear. The brakes are Shimano MT400. Both wheels have got boost spacing and are held in with through axles. The bike comes stock with Maxxis Ardent tyres, and that leaves us with this bike's USP, its full carbon frame. The frame features a moderate number of smart looking decals, but really blows it away when it comes to the pearlescent orange paint job. And with that, let's get on with my first impressions of owning this bike. So for the structure of this video, I'm going to summarise the bike's performance in a number of different terrains that I believe the bike has been designed for. So we'll start out with how this bike performs on looser, gravelly far road conditions. I think the first thing you really notice here is how stiff the frame really is. The bike feels incredibly responsive, and it feels like every newton meter that you put through those cranks is going directly to the wheels. Contrasting to this, the RockShox Judy fork actually soaks up a large proportion of the smaller bumps, and complementing this, the 29-inch wheels do roll over a lot of the bigger rocks, and this makes for a very comfortable yet responsive ride. The Maxxis Ardent tyres roll incredibly quickly on the gravel, but only being 2.2 inches on the back and 2.25 inches on the front, it does sometimes feel like you are lacking that control in the corners. This problem is slightly compounded by the geometry of this bike, because it's got a relatively slack head angle, more of a trail-focused geometry. It means that when you're sat in the saddle, you've got a very light front wheel that's very far out in front of you. Of course, this can be countered by getting out of the saddle and transferring more of your weight over to that front tyre. And I have unfortunately found this out the hard way by eating the dust on my first ride, having the front wheel completely slide out from under me, which is not something that I was particularly expecting. That said, once you do get the correct weight distribution on the bike, you can begin to carry a lot more speed into the corners and not be too worried about coming off. I found that the Shimano MT400 disc brakes work really well in this terrain, no signs of overheating on the longer descents, and the only real limitation to the stopping power of this bike are from the Maxxis Ardent tyres. The SRAM SX Eagle group set provides a more than adequate range of gears for this terrain. However, I would say that on the descents you may find that you're limited by the top speed of this bike, which I found to be around 38 km per hour. I'd say that if you're never getting into that 50-tooth cassette, you live somewhere relatively flat, I'd probably upgrade the front chainring to a 34 or 36 tooth. But apart from that, I found the shifting on this bike has been absolutely incredible. I've got SRAM GX on a different bike, and honestly, I can't tell a great deal of difference between the two. So I think all in all, this bike performs incredibly well on loose gravel terrain. It's got the speed and stiffness of a cross-country hardtail, but as long as you remember the adjustments that you may have to make for the geometry of the bike, I think it definitely can handle itself at these higher speeds. So I want to just quickly discuss a bit of an elephant in the room for this bike, and that is its weight. So the claim weight for this bike is 12.8 kilograms. I actually weighed mine in, it's a size large, and it came out as 13.1 kilograms. So definitely not the lightest thing in the world. And I feel like if you're buying this thing for the weight, you might be a bit disappointed in its stock form. I'm certainly sure you'll be able to find something that is just as light in alloy. Of course, I've not had the chance to take this bike completely to bits yet and weigh the frame, so I can't really compare it to an alloy bike necessarily. However, I have identified a few areas that I do believe you can save a lot of weight on, and that would be the forks and the wheels. I think there's a lot of weight to be saved there, and I'm definitely going to look into this in some future videos. I think the main selling point for this bike over an equivalently priced alloy bike definitely is the stiffness of the frame. Of course, there is always a little bit of a risk when buying carbon fibre frames at this price point, but I can't necessarily speak for the reliability of the bike at this point. I suppose that will have to come in a later video. So very quickly, we'll talk about how the bike performs on the road. Pretty much performs like every other mountain bike, feels very nice and planted, lots of stopping power. Of course, the stiffness of the frame is nice, so if you're doing any longer climbs up to your trails, it won't feel like you're losing so much power to the frame. The lockout on the fork is also quite easy to access, so if you're going up any large climbs, again, this will be useful. Having a remote lockout will be nice, but I don't really feel like it's necessary for this level of bike. So finally, this brings us to how the bike performs on the trail, which I do believe is what this bike was really built for. The geometry definitely suggests so. That said, my first impressions out on the trail were not necessarily very good. I was a bit concerned that the 29-inch wheels were going to make it very difficult to control the bike in some of the lower speed scenarios that you might find out on the trail. But once you do get used to how much force you have to put on the handlebars, how much you have to lean to actually get the bike to turn, I feel like it's actually very planted. And because it rolls over so many of the features, you do feel like you've got a very fast bike. You feel very stable on it once you are at the higher speeds. And despite what my feelings were on that first ride, I did actually beat a number of PRs, especially on the flatter and less technical sections. I found that this bike absolutely flew on the single track. I don't think that was much of a surprise considering how well this bike performs on the gravel sections. If there's any trail features that require you to do a slight manual or for you to get any air, this bike performs incredibly well. In fact, almost too well when manualing this bike. It's very, very easy to manual this bike. Because of that light front end, and I guess because of the geometry of the bike, you've got to be a bit careful that you don't actually overshoot and go over the back of the bike. And this is actually followed on very nicely for the smaller jumps that I've done on this bike. There is actually a sticker on the bike that says to avoid any competition, stunt, or any aggressive off-road riding. And I don't know whether they just stick this on generically onto any bike that they sell there, but I think it really comes down to the amount of risk that you're willing to take with this bike. Me being a 98 kilogram rider, I feel like it's probably not a good idea to go launching off massive jumps or drop-offs, and especially because I bought this bike second hand, so I'm not actually eligible for the Halfords lifetime frame guarantee if it does break. So just addressing the fact that I bought this bike second hand, so I didn't pay the full RRP. Obviously I paid about 65% of the RRP. But if I were to go into the shop and pay £1,000 for it, I think I'd still be very satisfied with my purchase. This bike definitely feels like quality. I'd say it's potentially even up there with bikes that feel around sort of £1,600, potentially even more brand new. So if you can get one, definitely try and get your hands on one. Go out and try and test ride it at least. I know they're kind of low on stock at the moment, but if you can get it at £1,000, there's sometimes opportunities to buy it at £900. I know that there's a trade-in scheme at some points in time, so you can even get the bike at £800. And if you get it brand new for £800, I think you've got an absolute steal. So I've got some fairly big plans for this bike actually. I think the great thing about it is that it is very easily upgradable. Being boost spacing, I've got a large variety of wheels that I can pick from. It's got a tapered headset as well, I believe. So I've got a large variety of forks that I can choose from. I'm just sort of looking at what the best deal is at the moment. In terms of the wheels that are currently on it, they're actually tubeless ready. So I'm probably going to convert to tubeless next week, and I'll do a video about that and describe how that's affected the bike, if any effects are noticed. So definitely tune in for that. So I hope my thoughts and opinions have been helpful to you throughout this video, especially if you're thinking of buying this bike. Obviously, this is only just my first impressions after riding the bike about 5 times. So I feel like a more in-depth review in the future is definitely coming after I've had some more time in the saddle, more time to make up my opinion about this bike. Anyway, I'd really appreciate some feedback from you guys. This is one of my first review videos. This is my first mountain bike review video on YouTube. So any sort of feedback, good, bad, any criticism, would really like to hear it in the comments down below. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.